Homage to the Triple Gem. So hello everybody, this is Bhante Joe here, and I'm just here at Dhamma-Pradeepa. This is a kind of a Vipassana center. It's a monastery, but they frequently run Goenka courses here. And just here looking for a kuti. So I've been looking in a couple areas, and there's some very beautiful places around here. So that's been really great to see. And so, remember several years ago I was reading this book, the biography of Ajahn Mun, and there's this portion of the book where Ajahn Mun is going through the jungle, and it's a biography, so it's a relation of real events, and they're going through the jungle, and Ajahn Mun tells the monks not to drink any of the water. And he says the Nagas, the Naga kings, basically he says, the Naga kings are striving against us. He says they poison the water. So for those who may not be totally familiar with Buddhist cosmology, Nagas are these kind of like snake-like beings. They're a lot like dragons would have been in ancient China or all over the world. They're kind of very snake-like. They have a lot of abilities. And they're kind of hidden. They don't have to appear to people if they don't want to. And they also have this kind of poison, being kind of a little bit snake-like. So he says that they've been striving against us and they've poisoned the water, so don't drink any of the water. And one of the phrases that he said was, it's only going to be a matter of time before they give in. He said, because good is more powerful than evil. I've always, basically, good is always something that's more powerful than evil. So I remember growing up as a young man, and you kind of grow up watching like Star Wars or these other movies where whoever is evil is actually pretty powerful, and they usually have all these kind of abilities, and the good people, they seem like very kind, very sometimes good people can seem like kind, a little bit weak, maybe a little bit too trusting. And you've got these evil people, they have like the craziest weapons, and the good people are always stacked against innumerable odds. So the two things, like in pop culture, almost seem like they're equally weighted, where you've got kind of goodness being almost equivalent to evil in terms of its power, in terms of its ability to fight and to sustain itself in the face of threats. You have this kind of the sense that evil is actually this power that can go out and just obliterate things, and good is like this almost defensive power that is about as strong as a flower. Say like caught in a wind. It doesn't really have this capacity to go out and destroy things in the same way, let alone to defend itself. It seems kind of that it's this force that is weak in comparison to evil. One of the interesting things is that when we look at the patterns of the way that goodness and what we call like evil, for the lack of a better word, play out, is that when people practice things that are good, like the keeping of the precepts, like generosity, meditation, then actually their world becomes good. It becomes a good place to be, even if a person is alone. There's this sutta where the Buddha says that when a person is alone, then their good deeds cover them over, or their evil deeds cover them over, whichever one it is. And when you're alone, your good deeds cover you over. You can feel at ease just being alone, even in difficult circumstances where one is losing everything, perhaps even on the verge of losing one's life, losing one's property. One can feel somewhat at ease in that situation. One of the reasons for this is that this kind of goodness is something that makes the mind strong in and of itself. It makes the mind a good place to be in and of itself. And when this goodness is shared, not just by one person, but by 2 or 3 or 4, that kind of situation is one in which the sum of the parts is greater than the individual parts taken together, than just the individual parts added together. It's something that creates a synergy. It creates a situation which is better, more beneficial than the sum of their parts. And when people are good, what tends to happen is that they want to look for situations in which more than one person wins. So it's not necessarily a force that has to go and look at what another person has worked to accomplish, has worked to gain, and goes out and tries to take it from that person. This person's worked hard, they've got something really good. I'm just going to go and steal whatever they've worked to achieve. It's more of a force that looks at what a person is. If another person has done something well, they've achieved something good, then it rejoices in what that person has done and tries to look for ways to, emulate them, even going up to the person and asking them, how did you do this? I really admire the qualities that you have. And if that person is good, they also may share their knowledge, share how they did whatever, how they developed these good personal qualities that led them to whatever success it is that they have. So in this way, that person gains in strength, and so does the first person. And also, even if they have material goods, it can be this thing where a person wants to share or trade. Share. Ideally, what you have that I can give. How can I share with you? And other people think the same. In this way, like a small group working together like this can actually become relatively wealthy, because you imagine that there's a group of people, one person has a hammer, and rather than just keeping the hammer for themselves, so everybody's got to buy a hammer. They share it with other people in the group. You don't need to have a hammer all the time. It's kind of the number of times you need to have a hammer relatively rare. Like if you take a 24-hour period, you don't need to be carrying a hammer like all the time, unless one is a carpenter, maybe. So what that means is that each person needs to work less to get the same result, and they can devote that energy to other things. Now, the backdrop behind this like +1+1 relationship is the precepts, basically, that people are not lying, not killing, not engaging. People aren't engaging in illicit sex. People aren't stealing. People aren't taking intoxicants and these kind of things. If a group is doing this and they're generous, then this is the background, this kind of trust that allows for these mutual relationships to grow, mutual relationships that are beneficial for more than one party. So when a situation is like that, then it's something which can take a situation which is bad or even not that good and turn it into something good. Turn it into something that's beneficial, turn it into something that gives strength to everybody involved. And these are some of the characteristics of goodness. One of the other interesting things about goodness is that, especially when you meet like very senior monks, very respected monks, their goodness isn't this naive goodness where it's like, well, we should all be one, and I'm just going to give to whoever, no matter what they say, no matter what they do. There's also wisdom to goodness. Wisdom is the foremost quality. It's kind of discernment is the foremost quality in Buddhism, and this discernment is something that has to be used to determine the intentions of the people that one is interacting with. Are they good people? Are they people who are keeping the precepts? And what do their actions show about their intentions? Like, what do their actions show over a long period of time? One of the things with people in general is that people are creatures of habit. So, that's just the way that the mind works. The way, if one develops a habit over time, then that becomes basically one's character, and it becomes difficult for a person to undo, especially the more that they age. And what one tends to find is that when one looks at the patterns of a person's life, whatever they've been doing for a long time in the past, that's probably what they're going to keep doing in the future. I mean, there's going to be, you can see if there's a trend, often things don't remain stagnant. So if somebody's been becoming more and more evil, been doing things that are worse and worse, it's probably a progression that's going to continue. If they've been doing things that are better and better, they're becoming a good person, and the people that, you look at their past and the people that they've associated with are now stronger, everybody's benefited, then that's probably going to continue into the future. So what you notice about these very great teachers is actually if you go to stay with them, they're extremely compassionate, extremely generous. They're also not a pushover. So you tend to have this, you can have this mixture of almost like fear towards them, but also, affection and kind of like a love and respect for them. So to be a good person doesn't necessarily mean that one has to be a pushover. And one of the recommendations that the Buddha gives, there's several, is that when one is giving, that gift should not harm oneself or other people. And this can actually be one of the most difficult things about giving, is to give a gift in such a way that one is not denigrating oneself. One is around somebody who's like evil, they're doing bad things, gives a gift to them, that's going to come back and damage oneself. There's other ones too, like if the Buddha when the Buddha talks about money, he says, that a person should, that they should guard their wealth, thinking how can kings and thieves, and unwanted heirs not steal this? In other words, you're setting up a guard. So the things that a good person has developed through their industry, through their toil, through their hard work, through their sharing, through their generosity, through looking for these +1+1 relationships, those are things that that a person then needs to set up a guard to make sure that, for lack of a better word, evil people don't steal it. So evil actually tends to be the opposite. I mean, these words one can use quite loosely, but in the Buddha sense, one could say these are people who are breaking the 5 precepts. When a person is evil, what they essentially tend to be looking for is not necessarily how to take like a seed, plant it, grow it, and do the work to put it in. They look at another person's efforts, they look at another person's crops and think, how can I steal that? I think if I just took that, then I would have so much more. And so this actually becomes a much greater temptation the more prosperous things are, because there's work and effort involved in making things grow. And there's a delay, there's a time lag between the effort one puts in and the time when the benefits come. So actually, at times when, say, a person has accumulated a lot, people have accumulated a lot, there becomes this temptation to spend more than one is putting in. And so to consume more than one is producing. And this pattern is not something that's going to immediately destroy the wealth or the prosperity that one has built up, or the good relationships, everything that we might consider good that one is built up through this effort that's wholesome, through this engagement with other people, with the world, that's based on generosity, that's based on sila. And one starts to consume this, to destroy it immediately, it's not apparent that one is going on a downward trend. Actually, one's fortunes seem to increase. I mean, you can imagine what would happen if somebody had built up all this money in their bank account, then they start to spend more than they earn. I mean, immediately they're going to have more sensual pleasures, but long term, they're going to have much less. So when a person tends to have this mentality, then they apply it to themselves and they start to apply it to people around them. And they'll start to do this as a show of strength. So they gather weapons or whatever, social weapons, physical weapons, and they use those weapons to try to force other people to give to them or to take things from other people that they actually haven't earned. That's not a mutually beneficial arrangement, and something that where they'll end up at +2 and the other person will end up at -4. So if you were to graph this over time, of course, it's not something sustainable. I mean, what will tend to happen over time is that initial person or that initial group, initially, like at the beginning, they might gain more wealth. But this kind of behavior, as it becomes a norm, as it becomes a pattern, even within that group, where you're going to see, instead of people looking to be generous, looking to do +1+1 type things, is you're going to see people looking to take things from other people so that they're at +2 and other people are at -4. So it's going to be a situation in which the motivation becomes less one of doing the work necessary to grow, to put in the causes so that benefits come, and one in which one is looking to basically burn one's investment, to take what one can from the crops without planting new seeds, and get the immediate benefit, but at the cost of long-term fallout. So evil tends to be like this almost all the time. It's kind of, it's not usually a quality which one becomes evil and then, things, from a really desolate position, things just generally start to get better. And so evil, because of this, tends to be weaker than good. It's not something that's stronger than good, although it has this outward projection of power or strength, because that's basically what evil likes to do, kind of go out and take things from other people, destroy things that other people have built, and get some short-term benefit for themselves. But actually, even that internal structure where people in that zone of evil, in that group of people who are doing these things, whether it's a smaller group or even a country or whatever it might be, the motivation to actually do things that build wealth becomes weaker. So these people are actually not necessarily stronger. So when you look at actually the way that these things play out in history, I mean, in the movies, the people who are good are sometimes almost 100% good, and the people who are evil, they're 100% evil. But in the real world, people are often not like that. It's more like a percentage, people are 75% good and 25% doing bad things, or they're 75% doing bad things and 25% doing good things. But what you tend to see in history is that the people who are doing generally evil things, they are not as strong as people who are doing good, say in the long run. So, I mean, people can argue about this in history, but you see the way that World War II played out in history. Or even if you like to look at the way that empires rise and fall, in the Roman Empire, in its infancy, I mean, it was doing some evil stuff. It ran out of women one time and went and just stole all the women from another village. and they were engaged in warfare, but they had these virtues to them that allowed them to band together. And they're farmers, they were generally hardworking. And these kind of virtues, they were ingrained in the society as something that would lead to prosperity. They were also a kind of aggressive military power. But they had these kind of virtues underlying their society that gave their, this is not an advocation for military overthrow of anybody, but this is what gave their military strength. At the end of the Roman Empire, evil had become so ingrained, like this idea that you have to cheat your way to the top to do bad things. And it just become ingrained that emperors will do anything to satisfy their wants. They actually couldn't resist a barbarian tribe that had come in and had adopted their norms, and they even killed this commander who had made a deal with the barbarian tribes that actually would have strengthened them. And later, the Huns came and basically completely destroyed Rome. If they'd made this deal, they might have been able to resist the Huns, but they killed this commander who had many, you might say, of the old good Roman qualities to him, kind of the last great Roman general. So when these qualities become present over time in a society, in a group, wherever it might be, then they lead to the degeneration of that society over time, whatever initial gains they might have. So what does this mean for a person? What does this mean personally in practice is that a person should always have faith in goodness. And that this goodness is something that one shouldn't just accumulate, for no reason, because the way that the world tends to work is that good and evil actually can follow on each other. This temptation to take more than a person is put in grows larger and larger the more the surplus that one accumulates is. The greater the surplus, then the less the initial consequences of taking a bit more than a person has put in, and the greater the initial benefits. In this way, gain and loss tend to spin around each other. And there's this teaching called the 8 worldly winds. Gain and loss are one of the things that spin around each other. They're essentially one of the same things. So we were chatting about in another video, the aim of this goodness then is not just to accumulate it for no purpose, it's to reinvest it in higher and higher levels of goodness that lead to higher and higher levels of happiness. And this happiness that a person gets just from keeping sila, from having good relationships, is one thing. But one can cultivate higher levels of happiness with that as a foundation. One can turn one's mind to meditation. One can turn one's mind to look at seeing what it is that causes one to suffer. And this is a higher level of goodness that one reinvests in. One of the difficulties, the big difficulties when, say, one is living in a period where there was this long period of goodness, where people were generally speaking, I mean, history again is never 100%, but generally peaceful, generally trading with one another, engaging with one another in a way that was generally +1, and the world as a result generally was much richer, much wealthier than has ever been. When that starts to break down, one looks at the people who are in power, who are on the global stage, and sees that the people who are really, really evil, not just 25% or whatever, doing a few evil things behind closed doors, but just overtly evil. And the people who are doing this seem to be accumulating in power, seem to be accumulating in wealth. It's important to remember this principle that good is actually always more powerful than evil, but it can't be a goodness that one develops that is naive. I mean, it has to be a goodness that recognizes the presence of evil, doesn't give gifts that damage oneself or other people, and sets up protections for one's wealth from kings, from thieves, from unloved heirs. Because when the whole world is pushing in this way, it's very tempting to abandon the idea that goodness is actually something useful. It's kind of, and just go with the flow. But to whatever extent one does that, then one's world will become a darker place. One's evil deeds cover one over when one is alone, and one tends to need to do more evil deeds in order to get whatever short-term benefit it is that will mask the pain that one feels from having done these things. From the knowledge of what one is doing. So there's this not obscure, but rarely practiced meditation called recollection of the devas, in which a person thinks to themselves, the devas in such and such a realm have such and such virtues. I too have such and such virtues. So I could go to this realm of the devas if I wanted after death. And this is not something that's generally practiced, but it is something that can give the mind quite a lot of heart. There's the mind quite a lot of strength, quite a lot of backbone in difficult times when everything else seems to be falling apart. Because there is this kind of intuitive faculty in the mind where people can kind of know without expressly, using the rational faculty. One can just have this sense that, one can have the sense, I could go to this place. So one can ask oneself this question: where is my compass pointing after death? Is it pointing in a good direction or a bad direction? And to keep going in the direction which is good, even when the road gets rough externally. So there's this person who was very close to me, kind of like a father figure when I was young. And he officially didn't believe in heaven, but there was one time we were sitting alone, and he said to me, I know I'm not going to heaven. I don't deserve it. I haven't done enough good things, basically. I mean, although he was an atheist officially, he had this internal sense. So, especially when times are dark, it's important to remember this principle that good is always more powerful than evil, and that good is something that should never be abandoned. It's something that should be held on too tight, even in the most difficult times. Because actually it's always been doing good, which builds happiness, which builds gain, which builds prosperity, which builds anything that's basically beneficial. It comes from doing good. It's always been evil that destroys these things. It's just a matter of how much and at what rate it destroys the accumulated goodness that has been brought up when it's engaged in. So it's also important to recognize that these things spin around one another. So if one just stays focused on worldly gains in and of themselves, inevitably the temptation can grow that it'll start to seem a little bit better to take more than one is putting in. And in this way, gain and loss spin around themselves. So the Buddha points us in a different direction. He points us in a direction that doesn't lead in this circle, that leads out, that leads in a straight line out. So one can take this goodness that one has and reinvest it in higher forms of goodness, reinvest the stability that one gets from one's relationships, from the precepts and meditation, and invest that meditation in developing discernment. What is it that I'm doing to keep causing myself to suffer? Why do I actually desire these things in the first place? And are they giving me what I want? And this is where goodness can reach its culmination. It can reach its culmination in the ability to step past goodness and evil itself, to step back past conditions itself. And this is the culmination of a person's practice. This is what we're aiming for in our holy life, is this state which is stable, a stable happiness, a permanent happiness. And it's goodness that leads there. It's not evil. So this goodness is something very important to protect.